Thank you very much. Critical race theory is being forced into our children's schools. It's being imposed into workplace trainings, and it's being deployed to rip apart friends, neighbors, and families. For many years now, the radicals have mistaken Americans' silence for weakness, but they're wrong. There is no more powerful force than a parent's love for their children, and patriotic moms and dads are going to demand that their children are no longer fed hateful lies about this country. The left is attempting to destroy that beautiful vision and divide Americans by race in the service of political power. By viewing every issue through the lens of race, they want to impose a new segregation, and we must not allow that to happen. Today, I'm also pleased to announce that...
Adam, if I may come back to you, I mentioned the topic of whether we need to look to generational change, but we've also talked about momentum behind things like the Black Lives Matter movement, which seems to have sprung up relatively quickly and gained that kind of popular thrust that we've been talking about. Do you think that if enough people get behind these sorts of movements, we can actually get things done sooner? If there is a leadership at a national level, ranging from people like Ming in his role, political leaders of all types across the spectrum, is this kind of a moment, perhaps the one that's been forced on us by the coronavirus and all the rest of it, where we can grasp things and make change happen much sooner?
Yeah, I think all of the panelists have raised interesting points. We're talking about the spotlight on racism that the Black Lives Matter movement has cast, which is great, but I also take the point that little has happened as a result of that. So while there's been attention on racism, while we can talk about racism a little bit, not much change has actually happened. So New Zealanders have always been very good at standing up to racism overseas, not so much about challenging racism that exists in Aotearoa. Paul talked about needing to challenge institutional racism, and it's really appalling that if we look over at the news for the last couple of years, how many universities have had claims of racism against them, when you would hope that an institution like a university where staff should feel free to talk about, to challenge their own institutions, and yet the atmosphere, even at universities, is one of fear. So what is it like for somebody who works in a bakery or a restaurant, or what is it like for somebody who provides essential services? What type of support do they have to challenge racism where they work? When it comes to that intergenerational change, it's Paul kind of mentioned how there was work done decades ago, and how things have got worse since then. So we can't just imagine that things are just going to get better over time, because there are massive global movements at the moment that are pushing us in the opposite direction. So just because we're talking about racism now doesn't mean that it's actually better. It could be a sign that it's worse. If we look at what's happening in the US at the moment, anti-racism is being called propaganda by their president. This is incredibly worrying for everyone across the world. And I think this is time for New Zealand to seriously consider our relationship with the US and to disentangle ourselves from them, because the situation is really deteriorating quickly there.
You've raised a couple of very interesting and pertinent points there, and I thank you for that. I would like to touch on the first one and ask Ming whether you'd be willing to talk about it. Do you think, from the wide range of contacts that you have with people interested in, affected by racism, racist attitudes in New Zealand, do you think that we are somewhat complacent about the race relations situation in this country compared to what's happening elsewhere? Arama mentioned the US. do you think we have a kind of optimism bias that institutional racism, other forms of racism, are for other people, less so for us?
Look, I think there's a denial, definitely. But you know, the problem with racism and discrimination, abuse, is so large in New Zealand, that I personally believe that if we can actually support Māoridom in their futures in New Zealand, that it will go a long way in eliminating racism. And because they are the tangata whenua, and we're not treating the tangata whenua in our tangata whenua land in a human rights perspective. There's many statistics that are so bad, but I'm very keen on co-design, devolution of services where Māori have come up and supported themselves. They've actually come up with solutions. And you have a look at the Kohanga Reo movement, the Whare Wānanga, the universities that are Māori, Awanuiarangi, Raukawa, the Whare Wānanga, Aotearoa, Kura Kaupapa, their children and their students, they actually excel more than general Auraki schools. Now, the other part is actually, you know, there was a notion that we're not going to trust these Māoris with all of this treaty money, right? Now, if we just go back a few years, right now, when many of the iwi have settled, the success stories, the demystifying of uselessness, hopelessness, not working together is quite the opposite. And when actually have those straight up conversations that Māori know actually are very knowledgeable in how they actually critique their future. Their future is intergenerational in our country, and this is the only intergenerational race actually, because their lands and their assets are actually handed down to generations and generations, and hopefully for the next million generations. And we just need to actually pick one part, and I'm saying let's focus on tangata whenua. If we can get that manaakitanga, te aroha, te kaitiekitanga, all of those aspects right in Māoridom, I'm sure that will permeate throughout the country.
Well said. Thank you for that, Ming. I wanted to pick up on the other aspect of what Arama was saying, Guled, and ask you. Arama was talking about how in the US, anti-racist expressions, the articulation of an anti-racist point of view has been dubbed propaganda. And we know, of course, that propaganda has a highly negative connotation. From your point of view, Guled, what's your take on the way that the media is portraying issues to do with racism and discrimination and intolerance in New Zealand? Have they roughly got it right, or are there some distortions that, as Arama said about the US coverage, that should be seen by us as deeply concerning?
Yeah, look, Chris, I think the issue of the media contributing towards the problem of racism is actually quite a well documented. And we've seen this across a range of disciplines and areas. Just look at criminal justice, for example, and the way in which crime is reported. Ethnicity is almost always used in stories concerning Māori, and other minority marginalized groups. You know, and if it's not ethnicity, it at least include their background context. For example, you know, they might mention the fact that this person was from a refugee background. Things like that. It's not done in the same way. I mean, have you ever seen an article that said white man arrested for stealing this? Like, that never happened. Or European man, or whatever. What do they prefer? Caucasian? Like, we don't even see that. We don't see that. That's never ever reported on. So, look, we'd be lying to ourselves and critique the role of the media in that space. I think partly the way in which it comes down to, again, is that it goes back to structural barriers in which that exist. If you look at the media is very white. I've been to newsrooms, and honestly, I've never seeing it look so homogenous in my life. And that in itself is part of the problem. You know, journalists have an important role to play in telling the stories of New Zealanders. And I think that in itself is we're not well represented enough in that space. And not just that.